is something of a reflective moment for Scots as we look back at 10 years exactly to the day since the independence referendum. And I want to use this moment of introspection to look back both in the short term over the events of the past year and in the long term, longer than 10 years, in fact, the long arc of devolution and before, as we discuss the nature of the political economy of the country and how that affects housing, politics, and equalities. So this has been a year of riots in England, similar to the scale of riots we saw just over a dozen years ago in around London and the southeast and a few other places in England. Very different in nature, however, in that the riots were primarily of a right-wing nature, not so much a response to police violence as a response to beliefs about immigration. And it's notable that Europe at this time is moving further and further to the right. We've seen in Germany the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, the far-right group, growing out of fears of both immigration and housing shortage. And in fact, Germany has been criticised in recent days by other European countries for essentially ripping up some of the Schengen protocols and the open borders we see throughout the EU. So there's something strange that's happening across Europe. And we're seeing it too in Ireland, where there has been a rise of what the protesters have called anti-globalism protests, but are essentially similar to England, against immigration and about the perceived threat to housing shortage that immigration poses, as is so put. So this is a tide that is sweeping the continent, where we see, and it's true throughout everywhere you look. You know, France just now has a prime minister who has been echoing the sentiments that Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National there has been making, the far right. So familiar, obviously, to British people because Michel Barnier was the man negotiating the Brexit settlement on behalf of the European Union, but also a man that is now steeped in anti-immigrant rhetoric. And that, you know, whichever country we look at, we're seeing the rise of the far right. And in Scotland, we have gotten used to the idea that we are exceptional, that we won't face these sorts of pressures. And yet we have been seeing them week in, week out in Erskine, where local fascists have been rallying against an immigration centre run out of a hotel and trying to make out the people who are stuck there are somehow being feather bedded, and that Scots are on the receiving end of an unjust treatment. And we need to look at what I think are some of the causes of this rightward shift in Europe and the focus of the right on on housing, because there is a huge housing shortage in almost every country, and that is as a direct result of the political economy of those countries. It's so much of a buzzword, but we talk about neoliberalism, this idea that the state must be an activist state on behalf of private capital, large-scale capital, and that is the economic model that we should pursue. And we've had that, I said, with going a long arc of history, we've had that really since 1979. And it's at this period in Scottish history. Now, we all know about deindustrialisation, and obviously we can point to Grangemouth that's taking place just now, but one of the other aspects of neoliberalism, or Thatcherism as it's called in Britain, is that things like rent subsidies were removed, council housing construction ground to halt. The post-war attempts at creating a humane social structure where we remove housing scarcity were essentially ripped up, and people were encouraged to buy their council houses, but no council houses were replaced. And over time, that fed a housing bubble, which was the beneficiary both of the strong pound due to the discovery of oil and gas in Scotland's coasts and seas, but also it was a way in which the deindustrialization could be masked for while the economy was contracting. Individuals who had availed themselves of their council house saw their property portfolio rise. And ever since 1979, there has been a conscious attempt to ensure that house prices will never reduce in value. And we can see some of the corollaries of that in the recent wrangles about the Scottish budget. Now, it was pointed out to the Scottish Government repeatedly over the past 10 years that rather than enforce Westminster-driven austerity, what the government could do instead would be to tax wealth. And they have resiled from that every opportunity. While it has been pointed out that Scotland has a higher income tax rate than the rest of the United Kingdom, we have the most unjust land system in the state, where very few individuals control vast tracts of land. And it was pointed out that a tax on an acre held, £200 per acre, could generate £15 billion. Now, obviously, that would be taxing wealth, and that's the kind of thing that can ultimately drive down house prices, particularly if we brought in a comprehensive system of rates. So what we are seeing is the long arc of the Thatcherite policies creating housing insecurity, housing crisis, homelessness crisis. And in the post-devolution era, we need to look at things like housing stock transfer. So wholesale housing stock transfer was a core policy of the McConnell regime, the Scottish Executive as it was called then. And the organisation that we're trying to build, the Scottish Tenants Organisation, at that point represented over 700 affiliates, 700 communities, 700 tenants and residents associations, and took the strong view that housing stock transfer was Thatcherite policy that would lead to housing insecurity and create monstrous housing companies that would exploit people. We can see stories in the United States of big investment houses like BlackRock buying up properties and shooting the rents up, artificially creating housing scarcity in order to generate as much wealth as they can for their shareholders. Now, in Scotland, the STO, because it took that position, was crushed by the McConnell government. And point to a video where we discussed how that happened with some of the people who were there in the links below. But suffice to say, our organisation received a hammer blow from the state in order to drive through housing stock transfer. Now, the first wholesale housing stock transfer, having spent about £50 million in propaganda, then an even larger amount of money in 2003 to drive through the Glasgow Housing Association as it was then, the first thing that the GHA did was embark on a mass demolition campaign. So it had two aims. One, tear down all the tower blocks in Glasgow, then having some of the highest densities of high-rise living anywhere in the world. Two, it would try and bring down its arrears among its tenants so that it could receive loans from banks. Now, in both, they were partially unsuccessful. So the first aim met with just practical problems. They weren't unable to tear down everything, and there was resistance. And two, basically the courts became so full of evictions cases that the sheriff authorities instructed the GHA that wouldn't be able to do this. So one of the reasons for why the McConnell regime was so keen to pursue housing stock transfer was that housing stock transfer was seen by the Gordon Brown fiscal as a means by which government debt could be made into private debt. Banks would fund housing associations instead of governments providing funding for council housing departments. And they promised in return to the councils debt write-off for those councils which pursued this policy. So this was effectively central government holding local government to ransom to pursue these housing stock transfers. But McConnell went one further than Gordon Brown in trying to ensure that there was wholesale housing stock transfer, basically a whole local authority rather than an individual housing scheme would be transferred over. And within a stroke of the pen, basically the GHA became one of the largest landlords in Europe. And although it divested itself of more than half of its stock through second stage transfer and a demolition on its own records of 17,500 homes, but the figures show that they're slightly larger than that if you consider those homes that were demolished immediately after second stage transfer. So what we saw is the loss of at least something like 20,000 homes in the city and subsequent demolition thereafter, with Wheatley, formerly the City Council Housing Department, I say Wheatley, is GHA as it was called then, having around half as many homes, but not breaking itself up as it was the supposed selling point. And that was the argument the STO made back then. The Wheatley Group, the GHA would not break itself up, and in fact, it's gone on to form the Wheatley Group, which is initially styled as a federation of housing associations around the country, over 9 now, and it has now subsumed them all into itself and become a large housing company contracting out services to other local authorities and housing association registered social landlords, as it seeks to increase its market share. And one of the things it's attempted to do in behaving more and more like a private entity is to change the nature of its stock portfolio from social housing, formerly council housing, with slightly higher rents than council housing, to mid-market rent and other forms of higher profit extraction. And while the organisation itself, as an umbrella body, is a not-for-profit entity, lots of its arms are for profit, and it now has major investors through bonds like BlackRock. So these big finance houses are now circling over Scotland's social housing, or public realm, built by the state in order to alleviate housing insecurity and prevent the growth of basically rationing shelter. So what does that mean in terms of the rise of the far right across Europe? Well, to my mind, it shows the urgent need for progressive politics in housing struggle, as broad as possible, but the need for progressive argument, because the sharks are circling. As I say, in Erskine, there are fascists organising just as fascists and racists are organising across Europe to say the reason that you are in a damp and mouldy home, the reason that you are overcrowded, the reason that you are on a waiting list is because of the men in boats, the men of fighting age are coming to take your houses. That argument is an argument that we are increasingly seeing in housing schemes in Scotland. And unless and until there is an alternative put whereby we restore housing justice, whereby we end housing insecurity, whereby we end the rationing of shelter, and we make that a national mission. Now, the STO has a policy we adopted at our last annual general meeting, whereby we propose the absolute right to public housing for any individual. Now, we know that the public housing isn't there to provide that yet. But that is the mission that we need to undertake if we are to stem this tide, because things are only going to get worse. We have, in the form of the Starmer government, another Thatcherite government, another government that is keen to continue the politics of misanthropy, the politics of shoveling cash into the private sector and deracinating the state. So unless and until we have that politics, and unless until it is in its ascendancy, we are going to face the kinds of pressures we've seen in England, in Ireland, in France, in Germany, and right across Europe, because we are not an island. And it is true that we have in the saltire flag largely only waved by the left. It is to a great extent a left-wing symbol in Scotland, but we are not immune to people waving that flag for division, racism, and fascism, and we're seeing that in Erskine. So we need to wake up, and I think we need to use this moment of reflection and candor about ourselves and our journey to say that yes, there are many alternative visions of the future, but there are some things that are baked in. Until we can see a different economic model, now I'm not going to posit how we get there, but until we see a different economic model, we are going to see greater and greater housing insecurity, and that is a handmaiden of the growth of the far right. So we need to use this moment to recapture a fighting spirit and go forward on that basis.